G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic start to your week as well. Now I thought that I'd push back my chemotherapy this morning to this afternoon so that I could make a video, but with the time difference this video may miss some things if they happen at least this afternoon Australia time, so I do apologise for that. Of course, we have a lot to go over with Ukraine launching now a new offensive into Kursk. So we'll go over what exactly has happened there, what may happen there, and how I see this. Of course, we'll go over all the other maps as well, as we do have a lot, and we will complete yesterday what we were talking about, of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And this part is going to be more about then Israel, Gaza, and China as well, and add my 2 cents on top of that. Now, one thing, of course, which is massive today that we will not be going through is Zelensky's podcast with, of course, American podcaster Lex Friedman. Now, this is just purely because I don't have the time to go through a 3-hour podcast today. I've gone through some of it. I've seen some of the clips, but I'll be listening to it and going through the transcript as well. And tomorrow bringing you my thoughts on this. So, look. Let's have a look at the maps and I'll show you where we're talking about. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014. Of course, the red check, new ground that Russia has made in the past 24 hours. But what we want to be looking at today is the blue, of course, crossing from Sumy back into Kursk. And this is where Ukraine launched its offensive now some 4-5 months ago into here, initially with a lot of success, but then that fizzling out. And what is being said is that today Ukraine has launched multiple offensives back into this region and redeployed a lot of forces. Now, what I will say is the fog of war here, it's still very difficult to see through. We'll need to give it a couple of days to figure out exactly what happened, exactly how much success has been made, and there's a lot of footage coming out that some are saying is older and being reused. So again, we'll have more of an idea in the coming days. But what we can see is one of the main axes that Ukraine was pushing on was out to the northeast. So I'll show you some geolocations and some footage. So you've probably seen some of this video like this. These are Ukrainian vehicles with cope cages on top of them, as much as I despise the word, and heading for this Berdin. And where these are geolocated is about 3 kilometers from where this zero line is said to be at the moment. So if we zoom in on here, these vehicles were seen, the geolocation right about here, and then this is Berdin just up on here. Remember, the labeling on this map can be a bit shit when we're talking about, especially back into Russia. So heading out in this direction. We also see a lot of footage of a lot of vehicles being taken out. Apologies, that was the wrong. This is the geolocation of that. Regardless, we know that where these vehicles are moving in these directions, but I apologize, I did show you the wrong one. It's actually the lead vehicle in this column that we see, but these, of course, different area. But what we do see, of course, are columns of vehicles doing attacks in this direction, as well as footage like this of a Ukrainian column advancing. I don't have a geolocation exactly on this, but you can see under heavy fire through artillery and, of course, minefields to drop off soldiers. Now, the amount of soldiers involved in this, it's very difficult to know because there's just so much misinformation around this. So what we've been thinking about in this is, could there be another axis of attack, and that this is just diverting eyes away from them? We have spoken about this. To have successful offensives, they need to be simultaneous and successive, especially if Ukraine want to then reintroduce maneuver into the battlefield. And Rybar has spoken about this. Against the backdrop of the AFU's attempted offensive in the Kursk region, there have been discussions since this morning about attack in the direction of Bolshoi, and this is a diversion, and the main strike could be in another sector. And some are saying up in Belgrade, some are saying got further west of here, but again, we don't know. But then that wouldn't surprise me. But what do I think about this? And I do believe, and I believe this from when this first occurred, that pouring more man, more machine into Kursk is a tactical and strategic mistake. But I'm not surprised to see this. But we need to sort of take this back just a little bit from what it appears like on the surface level and according to the traditional doctrine of attritional warfare too, because Ukraine's ability to replenish arms comes from positive outlooks from the Western states, and Ukraine's ability to replenish men at the front line comes from optimistic outlooks on the war within their own population. So in attritional war, any ground that does not hold a vital industrial centre is irrelevant. And that's why I criticise this so heavily, saying, but there's no industrial centre here. And what I was correctly then corrected on was, no, but Ukraine doesn't have a vital industrial sector. Their vital industrial sector is the informational war. That is the West vital industrial sector saying, yep, we will send more arms in. And we did see that in the beginning, Kursk did give Ukraine some relief from bad news coming from the south and the east for months and months and well over a year at some points too. And this did lift up morale and give some hope. And with exactly 2 weeks until Trump will enter his second presidency, and of course, he's saying that he's promising there's going to be a negotiated settlement and end to the war quickly. Well, Ukraine is saying that they want to be negotiating from a position of power. So to get into that position of power, or any leverage at all, or more cards on the table, of course, at this point in time, Putin is going to be holding far more cards on the table. Ukraine need to do something to have success on the battlefield in these last 2 weeks. But I hope that this isn't just a last-ditch effort to get an extra card on the table at the cost of sending your best men, your best weapons on a one-way mission. As we know, the logistics and medevac in Kursk is an absolute nightmare, and something that I think is being just assumed in all of this, and I can't see how people have built up this assumption. Well, I can, because they have had the assumption of being winning the war for 3 years. People have this assumption that Putin will just come to the negotiating table in 2 weeks. My fear is Ukraine sends its best men and best weapons into here to gain territory. Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table, and Ukraine is left here somewhat holding the bag. And this could absolutely happen, and Putin will just continue pushing in the east, the south, and that northeastern corner where we see daily advancements. We'll go over more of that in my breakdown thoughts here. But one thing people have been saying, the Russian pages have been saying, is that electronic warfare has been very successful in here. Due to the rapidity of the long-awaited offensive, it is impossible to use the UPMK en masse in the Kursk direction. The ping is high. So these are those FAB glide bombs. And this is exactly where maneuver warfare works for something like this, is these, of course, they can't correct on the move like, some traditional, maybe not traditional, but more advanced guided weapon systems. So as long as you're moving quickly, those FABs is very unlikely to hit you. This is what I've said about winter, is as things slow down and as it becomes more positional, the effect on those FABs is going to be largely increased. The drones, except those in fibre optics, have all fallen. It turns out that this is possible, which means that targets can only be found using long-forgotten methods, that is, through binoculars. So this is a very interesting piece, and we have heard again and again through a lot of Russian pages, is that electronic warfare is having a huge effect here, and a lot of the drones from your Lancets through to your traditional FPVs are useless. And there's a bit of footage here. I don't have the actual footage, but I've screen recorded or screen grabbed it where you can see the grain coming into the image, that the amount of EW that Ukraine has sent across the border here is really affecting a lot of these. But Kursk is the first place where we saw a lot of fibre optics, and still the place we see the most amount of fibre optic controlled drones. And there is absolutely no shortage of footage today. I believe majority of this being new footage of vehicles in here getting hit by fibre optic drones and by traditional drones. And what we've spoken about, the role of those fibre optics is not going to be just hitting everything. It's going to be hitting those EW assets, so you can use your cheaper, more numerous radio-controlled drones. Of course, there's other things to take into consideration, but simply put, somewhat like this. And we see here, these are Ukrainian mine-clearing vehicles and tanks moving through some of these areas, then being struck successfully with Russian drones. So there is no shortage of losses here, and I've never really understood, other than that PR, the point of Kursk somewhat. the Zelensky's office, so this is from the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, this is Andriy Yermak, has said in Kursk, good news, Russia is getting what it deserves. So again, we'll see what happens here. But we are seeing pieces like this too. And this is said to be from Russian Kar-52 helicopters with guided anti-tank munitions, then firing upon vehicles here. We can't exactly see what this is, but it will become clear in the next days. Was this successful? Was it not? What is going to happen? And what is Russia's response here going to be? So we'll bring up then the Syriac map of what is occurring here. Now, again, this is not the easiest thing to see, but we'll just go off where the roads are sitting. So let's look. This is this highway heading through here, and where then Ukraine has got up to, these red dots sitting, of course, in the villages that are here, of course, away from Martinovka and towards this Berdin, heading for this Bolshoi Soldatsky further northeast of here, and we'll see if Ukraine can get up to there. But what we have seen is that Russia did have then a further advancement, then along sort of down near the border as well, heading towards Sudzha. And this is one thing that the Russians may be able to do, is then use the confusion to push somewhere else, maybe down the border, and potentially cut off some of the logistical roads or networks that could run to support this. This is always going to be Ukraine's biggest problem. The deeper and deeper they go, eventually you're going to have to bring over more and more and more assets, which is going to be a problem along this border with the amount of ISR control that Russia does have here. So if we go through to here, at this point in time, some of the artillery will still be able to sit in Ukraine's borders, as well as the air defense, without having to cross here. But much, much further out, eventually it will, and it will be interesting to see if there is commitment to that amount. Let's look at what then Syriac says. It has not been long in coming. The Ukrainian offensive of 2025 has begun. The Kursk salient is being used as a launching point for attacks, with the aim of reversing territorial losses since August and even advancing further. This offensive is inexperienced as it may seem, makes sense to conduct it now during US presidential interim, and thus get Ukraine to have more negotiating weight once Trump accedes to the White House, being able to change the reasoning of the new US president to continue with the shipment of armaments to Ukraine. So again, like we said, that industrial base having a more optimistic outlook, putting good PR through the media and showing this. Again, what I say though is this is risky, as it could backfire. Although the media was so optimistic about Kursk, and when it started shifting, when the reality set in and then it did stall, and we didn't see then successive attacks, what then occurred was the mainstream media didn't talk about it at all, which of course played in Ukraine's favour. It's hard to find the reality of what's been happening in Kursk for some time. So my thoughts on Kursk. The initial PR for Ukraine was very valuable, and this is something that I did not take into full account at the time. But I did also not take into account how low the morale and the motivation was for continuing fighting as well. And that's become more and more clear, and that Kursk was somewhat of a band-aid on then a hemorrhage. The kilometre squares of areas captured was very surface level victory, but this was largely irrelevant when talking negotiations. This idea of a kilometre swap is just irrelevant. It's silly to have the conversation, because even if this was 1,000, 2,000, yes, it's going to be swapped. Yes, it's going to be 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1, or maybe it's going to be the opposite, depending who's in the position of power. At this point in time, in 2 weeks, it's difficult to see that the positions of power would have a pole shift, but the kilometre squares, that's surface level victories. But what the victory was here, that Ukraine did show the US that it was capable of offensives, and it did show that its people that it can have wins. And of course, the mainstream media absolutely ate this up, which of course affects positively the industrial base for Ukraine, the West. The mainstream media, who is overly optimistic towards the situation, has largely ignored when things here started going south. You wouldn't even hear about, at least to the same extent, about how half of this had been returned back under Russian control. And this was a large embarrassment and a blow for Putin when Ukraine did come in and occupy some of this ground. But I think that was overhyped as well. Well, yes, it was, but it wasn't as bad as many had hoped. There weren't riots in and around the Kremlin. And people saying, well, Putin has failed to return this by the 20th of January. And I believe, this will still be occupied when it comes to the 20th of January. But what you're not taking into account is what if Putin's not ready to sit down at those negotiations as well and everything has been poured into here. And if you look at this from an informational aspect, then this is one of Ukraine's greatest powers, is information rather than military. Ukraine is far more powerful informationally than military because that information can affect the world's most powerful militaries and then alliances like NATO to further support Ukraine. But if you look at this, so from that aspect, it's valuable. But if you look at this from a pure strategic perspective, other than PR and morale, it makes no sense for Russia to deploy the troops and systems needed if they don't plan to negotiate in January. So I think there's this assumption that Putin is ready to come and sit at the table January the 21st and call things a quits, not on his terms. But what I'm saying is it makes strategic sense for Russia here if they go, we're not going to do this. We don't care about the January 20th turning this back. Let's make Ukraine continue holding the bag and occupy another 500, 600 to 1,000 square kilometres here. This helps us. And like I've said, if Putin and his generals decide, no, we're not negotiating, we're just going to swallow our pride with some of Kursk being occupied, deal with the fallout of this. But strategically, as the numerically larger force, it does make sense for you to tie up Ukraine's best men, their best machines in this sector, while you continue to advance on sectors in the east. And I believe that the Russian command believe that Kursk will eventually be abandoned as the situation for Ukraine deteriorates in the east. And, of course, the weather here affecting logistics as well. I said this on the first days of the crossing into Kursk months ago. I said, I think the best way for Russia to actually counter this isn't put more troops in here. Try and stabilise it, get whatever you need to stabilise this, but push really hard down in the south and the east, and you will then reverse these gains by needing those troops to pull out. And I see again and again when things start falling, Kurakhove has just fallen, these other areas, people go, well, if only there was another 20, 30, 40,000 troops to stabilise that front instead of being in this area in here. That we don't know if it will continue to have that same PR value that it did in those initial weeks. We just see that declining, and now Ukraine has launched another assault into here. And I share a similar view to when Russia had their own Kursk offensive, of course, pushing across into Volchansk. If you go back and look at what I said when Russia pushed on these two axes in here, was don't get too caught up on just the kilometre squares. This is a marathon, not a sprint. This is attritional war. If that means you have to take a step back but tie up a lot of their resources, so be it. And Russia has done that. They've tied up a lot of resources in here, not as much as it did in the beginning sectors of this. But I said, if this means then these resources are not going to be going to other areas, you can use this to your advantage. And what I say is, while Ukraine has acute manpower and weapon shortages, opening another front line or reinforcing this and potentially jeopardising down the south and east, it doesn't make sense except from a PR standpoint, which for Ukraine is incredibly important. But is this enough to motivate more men to sign up? And will it be enough to convince Trump to continue the brutality of this war? Personally, I don't think so. I think Kursk from day one was a mistake. I think it was something Ukraine needed to do something. I can see why that is. But by the attritional warfare strategic doctrine, the PR value of this, the long-range weapon strikes, whatever else, I don't know if that outweighs what has now been lost down in the east. And I come from the opinion of wherever the border ends in this war is where the border, I believe, is probably going to be drawn. But if you ask me what else was Ukraine to do other than pour and stabilise, well, I don't know. It's an incredibly difficult thing, but I've always been very, very sceptical of the success long-term of Kursk and what has been lost in here and what has been tied up in here, especially if Ukraine want to further expand this. What's it then going to look like down in the east and the south? Many are saying that Ukraine want to push for Gloshkovo. Of course, at one point they occupied all the way basically to Korenovo and had a bit of a entrapment in here due to where these waterways run and Ukraine bringing down those bridges. So as far as this new offensive, how successful it be, we don't know. Wait out and we will see. But my take on it is I've never truly understood Kursk other than informational. But if you're talking military strategy, tactical, which of course I know that can affect, it seems, and I think the map movements have shown, that it just jeopardized other areas while giving some warm and fuzzies to get more equipment. We can see many soldiers there also doubting why this occurred. So let's go to some other areas, and I've got some other geolocations to show you. So Kurakhove, this has come under complete occupation of the Russian forces. I believe it's probably been a couple of days this has been under occupation, so we can see where, of course, the deep state map is sitting. But if we go to a geolocation that I have, what we see here is a Russian flag then being flown by Russian soldiers at this location. We then geolocate this, and it's on this very outer building right here. So I'm willing to say that Kurakhove has come under complete occupation. Of course, this is closing up this pocket that was formed in and around this front once the Uspanivkia pocket had then fallen. So let's have a look at what Syriac maps are showing in and around this area. Not the exact same areas, but we can see that this is Kurakhove here. He's saying basically from Stary Turny, just draw a straight line down, and that all has come under occupation. But further movements out towards this red dot here is Petropavlivkia, which I showed you approximately 2 or 3 days ago, a geolocation showing Russians in this sector. Now both maps confirming that that is coming further under control. Then we jump onto the most recent Syriac, and this is Shevchenko, Petropavlivkia, that he is showing that the pocket that was formed between these has now come under control as well, heading towards then Andreevkia. As you can see, forming a larger pocket around Dashne as well. So let's pull out of here, and we will, just for now, we'll pull up into Turny. So this is Turny Ivanivkia. I showed you about a week ago where Noel reports showed that there was Russian presence across here, and I also showed you yesterday that Deep State was showing grey zone in here, and we have further confirmation that there actually are Russian forces in here with a flag going up. So Syriac maps, he is showing this, of course, showing that there is Russian occupation across the waterway in here, across the Zedebets, and the Russians are in Ivanivkia. Now, again, this is a large claim, so we waited for geolocations, and basically right on this sector right here, I've done the arrow as close as I can while still being zoomed out enough. We see then a lot of fighting here. So we see both Russian and Ukrainian forces in this video. Again, I'll put this on the Telegram that you can go through it, but near the end of this video here we see then a Russian flag on a destroyed building. But that does confirm, and you can see in the footage, Russians and Ukrainian soldiers, does confirm that the Russians are present here, if not occupying then parts or all of Ivanivkia. So Russia made small advances at the locality, so he's not saying that all of it, but we do know there's definitely presence in here as well. So let's push down a little bit further. We'll work our way down. So Toretsk, you can see there is some Russian advancement in here. Of course, Toretsk across different maps can show vastly different. So if then we jump onto the Syriac maps, you can see these two Telecons. He's showing that it's a further than northern push out of here rather than what's Deep State is showing. Not too dissimilar, except when we come just south of where it's showing. He's showing from Nepelivkia through Leonidivkia that this is further coming under control of the Russian forces as well. And in the center of Toretsk, we look on this little zoom in here, this area is what is being shown here. So he's saying it's right up into these areas. See this crossroad? This is here. So he's showing, Syriac is showing significantly further advancements than Deep State. And then on his most recent is no different. Further advancement down in here, but further advancement out through Leonidivkia as well, heading towards Petrivkia in this front line. Again, we will get a better idea once we get some more geolocations of what exactly is happening on this front. Now, I want to come up. I was saying we're going to work our way down, but I did miss one. And if I don't think of it now, I won't bloody find it again. So we have the Oskil in here. Of course, this is the Pishani front. And we have Raihodkia. And then we zoom in and we see this Nadia area in here. We have to zoom right in to see it. But just down in here, we have a Syriac update talking about this. So I've named it weird. If you ever think there's weird naming on my files, that's not for you guys. That is for me to know where I'm talking about if it's something like this. So we can see where this road comes out through Raihodkia, that Surak is showing just this area in here has a Russian army has increased this and has entered that settlement. So again, wait out on this, but it is showing outside of the grey and green on our other maps. Now we'll work our way down because we do have a Bakhmut update as well. We have Chasiv Yar, Bakhmut. There's been a lot of ramblings about Ukraine getting a lot of territory back in and around Klishkivka sort of area, and then today is showing some of this. So let's come in, and this is of course Chasiv Yar up in here and coming down in the direction of Klishkivka. The best way here is to line up where then this canal runs, so saying that Ukraine has cut back some of this area, and there's a lot of fighting in the center of Chasiv Yar over some of these industrial sectors. Then we'll come in the most recent just Chasiv Yar sector. We have a look at where then Syriac is showing, and this is vastly different. See this water like reservoir here? He's showing that it's right out in this sector and showing that the majority of Chasiv Yar has come under control. But wait out on this, these are significantly different. Again, showing if we take what Syriac is showing, somewhere about a mile, so 1.6 kilometers, different from what is being shown. So let's move our way down into the Pokrovsk sector. So I'm calling this the whole Pokrovsk sector, and then this is the east sector of what is occurring here. And we have seen day after day more changes being made exactly on this front. So this is what Syriac is showing. So if we come in and we have Baranivkia right up here, that, to be fair, Syriac, Deep State are showing fairly similar. Syriac is showing more filling in between these, but as far as movement in that direction on that axis, yes. And then we come just, of course, to the west of where we see these changes. Syriac is being shown that a lot of this, see where this grey zone is, has been getting filled in and showing red via his maps. So we have a look. Now, this isn't the greatest to see, but we have Baranivkia right in here and this main road and this main intersection. See, intersection, just to get your bearings, and showing that this red dot, which is right in here, that this is coming under more control and the Russians have started assaults on this locality. So if we go back, we will see then the grey zone here too. And what I'll say is when we see grey, then this is where Syriac will potentially show red. So we will see what is looking like in here, but how this can form then potentially the eastern flank of then battle for Pokrovsk, or the western flank for further envelopment all the way from Chasiv Yar down through Toretsk and eventually, potentially, through areas like Konstantinivka. But again, we will see. And again, this is going to take place if the war doesn't end in 2 weeks, which I don't think Trump is going to have the ability to do. I think there's going to be an offer made from the Kremlin, but I don't believe that offer with this period, with what we're looking at in the war right now, is going to be something that the administration is willing to accept. Where does it go from there? Well, we don't know. So let's have a look. We've got a couple of Pokrovsk maps. Now, this is this road heading right through here. Lysivkia, Syriac is saying that the Russians have got more ground to the south and the north of Lysivkia. We can see around Zeleny and Pishani, but again, Syriac showed that those were coming under further control in the past few days. We come up to the most recent one, and we can see just around this Pishani area, more ground being made, and more around Zeleny also. So again, we can confirm both of this red on this map is confirmed across multiple sources. But what this does show, though, is that the Russians are getting closer and closer to some of the roads that do feed into Pokrovsk and one of the train lines also. So if we go from here to here by shortest, we're talking now under a kilometre, and that probably wasn't the shortest of what I actually mapped there. So this should be of great concern of what is happening here also. So we'll continue our way down, and then we have Velika Novosilka as well. Of course, this road coming under at least fire control, potentially occupation. We have seen Russian forces on the northern side of this road, but we don't know what happened beyond that, because that footage was from Ukrainian drones striking these guys. So we have a look, and we have Vraminka in here. We can see that by Syriac, he's showing that the Russian forces are pushing further and further right on the western outskirts of Velika Novosilka. So we will see, and he's saying that these are the high positions which overlook the Ukrainian army movement in these areas. Remember, the envelopment in here could be very, very dangerous, especially with roads that actually lead in and out is incredibly limited, but the Ukrainian forces will not want to abandon this area because of the cost of it during the 2023 counter-offensive. Now, got one more, and we're coming right up into the northeastern corner around and this Dovorichna as well. We have seen the Russians actually cross the Oskil, which we hadn't seen for some time. And although largely ignored, we need to look at what Surak is saying, because he's showing daily changes in here. This is just showing as grey, but he's showing that all the way down, you can see just off like the terrain in here, down in and about this sector, this tree line right here, that is where the Russians have got. Russian army continue advancing here, reaching the pumping station here for an ammonia pipeline. So wait out on what happens up in here. I think the story of what's happening in the northeast is greatly ignored, but it's something which I think will become very, very relevant soon. I think this northeast is, it's just not seen to, but this whole Kharkiv offensive in here, and what it could be as well, is the Russians trying to get in Kharkiv, both from Vovchansk, the Holiboki, Lipsy front, as well as across in here, the equal kilometre squares for in Kursk, so there could be a swap back there. Because remember, what the offer is at the moment, well, I shouldn't say is at the moment, we don't know what might be offered, but what was offered was that Russia walk away with Kherson, Zab, Luhansk and Donetsk, therefore would be a withdrawal out of Kharkiv, but they would also want Ukraine out of Kursk. So could there be a kilometre swap back in here? Again, we don't know, because what I would ask is, I don't know at this point in time what is bringing Putin, to the negotiating table without requests that I don't believe the American administration could actually agree to. So we went through yesterday this interview by the New York Times with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and speaking about where the support lies, what has been happening, and basically his idea that the world is better now than it was 4 years ago. I would argue the world is worse now than 4 years ago, and I'd argue as well it's worse now than a decade ago as well, even before the spicy flu and before changes of administrations, that we're in a very, very bad spot at the moment. And I just want to brush through some of this. I'm not going to go over all these slides like sometimes, but there's just some pieces in here that I think are very important to speak about. And he talks about in here, they ask about America's will, and we stand back, use other methods to bend to America's will, and the difference between how Biden rules and how then Trump will as well. But he talks about here that the rising power and the challenges posed by China, and that they are engaged, has been grossly unfair to our workers, our companies, undercutting them, driving them out of business. And what I'll say here is, if China is doing that, is doing that, but that is not China's problem. That is your problem. If your businesses are getting undercut by China's, that's up to you, not up to, like, why are they going to fix this? Potentially tariffs, maybe this or that, but I think there is, as we'll see here, this sort of hangover of the amount of dominance the US had, and they still think that that exists with the USD. And this is something we will talk about tomorrow, about the power of the USD and the ability for sanctions to kick in. And he talks about here of ways of, America dealing with and cooperating more with the Europeans, when the Europeans are maybe looking to do deals with China, and talking about how much increase then building allies within Europe has built then the control of GDP. But what we can't forget in this is that BRICS is 35 to 37% of global GDP, and could end up a lot more, 40% of the population, and will end up a lot more. And the US is not as dominant as it once was, particularly when we speak about the USD and tariffs and the ability for sanctions to kick in, and how countries may just look towards other areas, and how dangerous this could be for America's hegemony around the world. So we're going to find out in the future of how this actually goes with the growth of China. And this is something that Zelensky and Lex talked about, was the idea of frozen assets in $300 billion mark going to Ukraine. Now, what we say is the problem with that, and this is what economists have spoken about, not just propagandists, they've said the problem is, could this really undercut the USD's influence? Because then China and Chinese billionaires, Chinese businesses and all these other countries may go, shit, well, if our government does something which we've had no involvement in, they will seize our money. And could this push then other countries, competing countries from India to China, wherever, to look towards a different currency or economic ties, something like BRICS? So the USD needs to maintain its dominance while on that seesaw of maintaining dominance and pushing its own order, but it can't push its world order to the point of which these all countries go, well, we'll stick it up your ass, we're going to go over here. Now, some will say that event horizon has already been crossed, but we will see. Then he's asked about then Israel's actions in Gaza and how they say 45,000 have been killed from the UN figures and 90,000 have been displaced, and what is happening here, and asking, are Israel's warfare practices consistent with then the international humanitarian law and laws of armed conflict, and how the UN committee has said that these are consistent with the characteristics of genocide, asking, do you believe these have been consistent with the rules of war? And this is just completely ignored, and a lot of it being put back onto October the 7th and the horrors that happened on that date. But the thing is, the horrors of what happened here do not then mean that you aren't accountable to your allies and internally to uphold those laws of armed conflict. And this is what I say about the horrors of which Russia has done to Ukraine should not ever be excused. But then when we see some of these drone drops, some of this other stuff, that doesn't mean that then you can just sweep that under the rug. And as I say here, answer the question in Knob Jockey, because it's not being answered. And what I have said here, and to relate back to, we typically talk about Ukraine and Russia, rise of the global south and the West v the global south or v Russia, is nothing has made Russia look better than America's response to the actions that Israel has taken out on a global stage. And I spoke about this yesterday. If you go in the comments and look at when drones are hitting Kyiv, and a lot of the comments will go, well, this is exactly what the US and Israel are doing daily to the Palestinians, as far as that informational space, which is absolutely critical for Ukraine. The response of the US and Israel, where they really do stand alone on an international stage with the UN and voting there, has had a huge negative effect on how people see the brutality of this war. Now, I know we can add nuance around, well, the density, the way that Hamas are fighting, the density of the population, and how it is. I know we can add nuance there, but what I'm saying is the average person isn't concerned about this nuance. They see it, and that can affect how countries in the global south view the West, view America, view these actions, view international humanitarian laws, and people within the West and in democratic countries can be seen of how then they further vote as well. So there's a lot in this. There's a lot of things at play. There's a lot of cogs turning. But have they met those responsibilities? And again, speaking about, we've found periods of time where no, we don't think we're doing enough. We're pressing very hard to take actions that will ensure more assistance get to people around things like food, but also while delivering billions of dollars in military aid. Withholding food aid is considered a war crime. So what he's saying to me is that actually they didn't want to even provide food. There's a big difference between intent and result, and I do agree on this, that there is a difference in intent of doing something and the result of it. And the results that we're seeing were grossly insufficient. Just making sure people are protected, I think that is sufficient. There's difference between will and the intent. So he's basically saying, no, the intent was not to do this, but the result then was this. But again, there should have been way more accountability and responsibility taken to actually do this. As in my opinion, I think I've shared this opinion with 90% of the people on the globe, there was not enough done to protect the average civilians within Gaza. It doesn't matter if you don't see eye to eye with the same God. It doesn't matter here or there. The international humanitarian laws are very, very clear about what can and can't be done. And when the US is trying to push that onto other countries around the world, why not upholding themselves, I think, does grossly undermine the US's power and influence around the world. I was watching a podcast the other day that said now with the rise of social media, America can't hide anymore because everyone anywhere is going to have a smartphone and see it, that there's going to have to be so much more accountability taken place, which will ultimately, and he was very optimistic, ultimately it will protect more civilians. So it is difficult. And the ICC is exactly a fantastic example of this, that the US, everyone was all behind arresting Putin for then war crimes and some other bits and pieces in that under the international criminal courts through the UN. And then when the UN overwhelmingly voted to put a very similar warrant for Mr. Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, then the US said, you've got no jurisdiction, this is bullshit, whatever. That just undermines all of that. And I think in this period of reduction of America's global dominance and the rise of dominance in the second world heading to, and the major powers and the battle for in that second or third world for them to come under as those countries lift out of poverty and have way more influence on a global scale, I think the US need to be very, very aware of how people view them heading into potentially more of a multipolar world, if not transitional phase into another pole being at the top, which America sees themselves. Many people would like to see America at itself, myself included, remain at the top because I'm a white Westerner, part of the West, but I think there are some big mistakes being made, and I think a big switching point here was the actions and lack of accountability in Gaza. And they speak about this, it was indiscriminate, entire areas flattened, indiscriminate weapons being used and tactics such as then the pages and things like this. And we're not going to go through all of this, but what is spoken again and again is about then the I guys, all the H guys, proxies, all of this. But again, this does not mean, though, that you are not mandated to uphold the laws of which you speak of, that you'll put one way, but you're really not willing to put on one of your other members. So there's a lot in this, I think, and I'm like, this is not a surprise that people overwhelmingly kicked you guys out of office, because I don't know which side you are speaking for in this. It's very different, I believe, from how most amount of people feel. There are moments it seemed you were trying to draw red lines in public, telling Israel not to go to Rafah, for example, and then they did. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu never seemed to listen to you. He says, I disagree with that. When it comes to Rafah, we have deep concerns about a direct attack and the use of 2,000 pounders in densely populated areas. What Israel went up doing in Rafah was very different from what they were planning to do before we engaged them. So, what ended up happening and who took accountability or responsibility for this? Because the US can have huge leverage on Israel, or was it a slap on the wrist and, we didn't like what you did, where we all know where it was. And the consensus seen through the world community is not this, that no, the consensus here is against the US and Israel as far as you just look at the UN voting. And I think that this has weakened the US to an extent we may not see come for a decade, but I believe the actions here has actually weakened the US and support, and how people think, well, some countries can bully the US around and they're not willing to have accountability. It's one of these hard things that America on the global scale, I think, has been weakened by the previous administrations, and I'll say administrations, not just the one gone, but acting as if it is the 90s, where America has the dominance and can hide things now that it cannot. So you feel you've been effective in shaping the conduct of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We can most effectively shape the conflict and bring an end to the conflict and getting a ceasefire and the hostages back. So talking a lot about the hostages taken and, of course, what occurred on October the 7th and the horrors of this. But again, have you worked effectively in shaping how things have gone? I don't believe so. You have a partner in Benjamin Netanyahu, because it's reported that he blocked a ceasefire deal in July that would have led to hostages being released. And what we see here is speaking about the killing of Hanya Sinwar. Of course, he was acting as chief negotiator. And what then Mr. Blinken talks about in here is now it went from dealing with one negotiator to just a whole bunch. And that made it far more difficult. All the understandable criticism of the way Israel has conducted itself in Gaza, you hear virtually nothing from anyone about the October 7th attack from Hamas. Why hasn't there been a unanimous chorus around the world for Hamas to put down its weapons, give up the hostages, surrender? And this is what I will say, and I've said this for a long time. Israel had sympathy, and we heard that chorus for about 2 weeks. Maybe it's 1 week, depending how you see it. It's difficult for me to analyse it because I was there at the time. But for about 2 weeks there was, then the bombing, then the horrors, and people's sympathy for this in the beginning then went out the window. I think people still have sympathy for what happened, but they've gone, but what has happened now the other way for now 14, 15 months, people have gone, well, we have sympathy individuals here, but then to say that this is just all then like our shared trauma instead of shared trauma, then people don't agree with. I do think that we should see a lot more people condemning and against then Hamas as a terrorist organisation. But with Israel being held to zero account, at least by the US, don't hold your breath for this. You've had a series of very public defections at the State Department over Gaza. The latest was Mike Casey, who said the State Department's deputy political counsel on Gaza and resigned in July, claimed the State Department frequently rolled over for Israel, that no one read his reports on civilian casualties, and saying basically I didn't need descent channel cables to have the facts in front of me. I get them every single day. I read everything. I comment on everything. I look for answers on everything. Does that mean we get things right every time? No, but we're intensely focused on, yes, my goal has been to end this conflict in Gaza in a way that makes sure that October 7th doesn't happen again, that ends the suffering of people and does it an enduring way to bring hostages home. But what I will say in this is the way that the US and Israel took actions here, in my opinion, it has radicalized 10 times the people due to this. So you're saying that there is a solution here. Well, you're saying that, yes, my goal has been to end this conflict in a way that makes sure this doesn't happen again. Well, how far are you willing to push in this? Because I believe that 10 times the people around the world have been radicalized than, have actually been killed in this. What if the solution is what we have heard before about final solutions? Because long term, I believe what is happening worse is actually because long term, what we are seeing is going to end up into a far, far worse war all around. But what is your solution here? And what will you back? How far is this willing to go? If, by the UN, people say that this is genocide, and you're saying, well, for October 7th to never happen again, war has to look like that. Well, how far are you willing to push this? Does that make sense? Do you think there's still hostages alive? He says yes. Blinken. Do you worry that perhaps you've been presiding over the world what is seen as genocide? No, it's not. First of all. Second, as how the world sees it, I can't fully answer that. I'll answer that through the UN votes. The majority of people in the world, just people and governments. Now, it may not be it may not be the US government, but the majority of people see this as very close to or a genocide. Just have a look at the uproar in basically every city in the West, as well as where countries vote on the UN. I think there is, in the wake of horrific suffering, the traumatization of the Israeli population and the Palestinian population. And yes, there has been a hell of a lot of trauma to both, but Israel has not suffered a tenth of the trauma that the Palestinians have. And you talk about terms of ending this. Again, these terms are going to be up in the US and Israel's interest to have an end to this, not taking into account other bits and pieces, which is getting very, very difficult for the wider Middle East. So have there been trauma in Israel? And was October the 7th just fucking horrible, should never have happened? Were the people that crossed terrorists? Yes, I agree with all of that. But then to just look at not maybe root causes or how the remainder of the world see this, I think is America again failing on an international level. Because if America want to export their world order and a rules-based order at that, and democracy, whatever, the first things people are going to look for is people upholding accountability of what you're trying to export as well. And this is where it links back to nothing has justified Putin's actions more than the way many countries see the US acting on the world stage. Does that make sense? Now, I'm here saying I don't justify any of it. I think it's all fucking atrocious. It's all bullshit. But from my observing how people act, people that a lot of I don't agree with and this and that, but I think that is, at least in my mind, subjectively true, that nothing has justified his actions more, or not maybe justified, but led to people not condemning them as far as the US's actions. Now, you could say this is whataboutism, you can say this or that, and I'm here saying I could build nuance and arguments both ways, but what I'm saying is you and I, of course, are incredibly invested in this. We're sitting here watching an hour-long video about this, but the average person, they may say, well, no, you're doing it, without adding that nuance, if that makes sense, and the news may not have time for it. There's been a lot of reporting on President Biden's declining abilities over the course of his term. You were the closest to him. You've worked with him for decades. But do I feel that many Americans want to understand the sort of changes the man? Whether you agree or not, I think it's a very strong record of achievement, blah, blah, blah. So, again, not the first time just filibustering around this. But, mate, the bloke you're talking about, the same bloke who has his hand on the nuclear button, he gets lost on stage and can barely speak. Now, that happens to me as well. Sometimes I get caught up in the teleprompter and this and that. And I think some of that is unfair on Biden. For those who have never spoken or read off a teleprompter on camera, it can be very, very difficult. But some of the stuff we see, mate, to say that Biden didn't have declining health, you're blowing smoke out your fucking arse all the way from the US to fucking Adelaide. So, yeah, it's just my piece. I wanted to talk about where I think the US is failing internationally on politics because people are sick of, I guess, hypocrisy there. Now, you can build nuance around this and that, but I think there is so much of this, and upholding, when we speak about upholding the UN Charter and we're upholding laws of armed conflict, we're upholding the IHL, I tell you, there's a lot of people living in glass houses, whether it be a glass house in the Kremlin or a glass house in Washington or a glass house in Canberra. If you don't know what Canberra is, it's where our government is in Australia. It's actually the capital. But there's a lot of glass houses with people living in them. Anyway, legends. You have a great Monday, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. I'm going to go take my chemo and feel fantastic for the rest of the day. Look after yourselves. Thank you. Bye-bye.